Greetings, everyone. Pastor Bob here with another installment in our series, Origins, the book of Genesis. This past Sunday, we looked at the Abraham story. We covered a whole lot of Genesis in that particular story, and I encourage you to go back and read from Genesis 12 up through about Genesis 22, which ends with that story of Abraham being told by God to go sacrifice his son Isaac. I want to pick up what happens after that, sort of an in-between thing here with that next generation. What happens with Isaac and his generation? And we're going to pick that story then up again in chapter 25 this coming Sunday when we begin to look at the story of Jacob and Esau. But I want to take this little interlude here to talk about what happens, because this is the next phase of the covenant promise. This is the long-awaited son that Abraham and Sarah had been promised. Now what happens with Isaac, and how do we move to the next generation? How does the covenant begin to move outward? And this family that God promises to Abraham, how does it begin to multiply? So let's take a look at chapters 23 and 24 in just a little bit of detail. I encourage you to read these for yourself. But we have the death of Sarah in Genesis 23, which is kind of an extensive narrative. There's a lot of negotiating that Abraham does with the Hittites who own that particular plot of land there in Canaan. But this burial plot that Abraham purchases represents a permanent property stake in the land that God had promised to Abraham. So think about the fact that Abraham has come from the east. He's been a wanderer. He's kind of been a nomad in that land where the land's been promised to him, but he doesn't own anything at this point. This is the first sense of ownership. And you might think of this as kind of a beachhead for what's going to be the promised land throughout the rest of Genesis. And then certainly in Exodus, it's all about Israel getting back there. Now, we're going to be talking about how Israel winds up in slavery in Egypt as we get toward the end of our Genesis study when we talk about the Joseph story. But that's going to be important much later. The point is that this is part of the land that Abraham has promised, and he's kind of putting a guarantee down on that by being buried there. In the ancient world, if you're buried somewhere, that's a very significant place. And so Abraham purchases this tomb for Sarah. He's eventually going to be buried there too. And it's also important to remember that this is the only promised land that Abraham is going to have in his lifetime. God promises him this land as far as he could see, his descendants as numerous as the sand on the seashore, the stars in the sky. But the extent of what Abraham's going to have by the time he dies is he's going to have this burial plot as part of that land, and he's going to have one son who's his heir. Now, he has other sons. We learned about Ishmael, born to Hagar. We're going to learn about other children that Abraham's going to have after Sarah's death, because, man, even over 100 years old, and Abraham lives to be 175, he's going to have more wives and more children, unbelievably. But the one that really matters is Isaac. So the promise is not fully realized here for Abraham. And I think he knows that. The writer of Hebrews certainly intimates that when in Hebrews 11, in that faith chapter, he's talking about Abraham not seeing these promises before he died, but recognizing there was something that was going to last long beyond him. And so this is the beginning of the covenant promise being seen here in Abraham: land, descendants, and blessing now passing to the next generation. So in Genesis 24, Abraham is starting to move off the stage, and there's a concern about the next generation. Sarah is dead, so the concern now is, how do we get a wife for Isaac? How do we continue the next generation? And so Abraham's going to send a servant to go back to Haran. Remember, this is where Abraham comes from, there in Mesopotamia, to go and get a wife from among Abraham's kin. Notice, he doesn't allow Isaac to go back there himself. One commentator I read suggested that after this incident on Mount Moriah where Abraham takes Isaac up to sacrifice him and he's spared there, that now Abraham is taking no chances with Isaac, doesn't want him taking a long journey. So he's going to send a servant instead back to Haran, a long, arduous journey over the Fertile Crescent to find a wife for him. And he makes the servant swear that he will find a wife from among his kin. That's important. And that swearing an oath, there's that curious phrase, and a lot of people ask about this, put your hand under my thigh. In the ancient world, that was a way of swearing an oath. When we swear an oath today, like in a courtroom, we put our hand on the Bible or we raise our right hand. The president, when they're inaugurated, puts their hand on the Bible as a sign of their covenant that they're making. But in these days, and scholars are really confused about what this might actually mean. There's some sense that swearing an oath, putting the hand under the thigh, and not to be graphic, but it means to put the hand under one's testicles as a way of saying this is a mark. This is recognizing the mark of circumcision, recognizing the mark of the next generation, the potential for the next generation, a way of swearing in that way. Some say it might be symbolic in that sense. Whatever it is, the servant is required to take this oath before he leaves. Don't come back with another wife from somewhere else. We want to keep this within the family. And that was important in the ancient world. We see this throughout the Bible, and it's not just an Israelite custom. It's a custom in other cultures as well. Endogamy is the social custom of marrying within one's clan or tribe. And that was the preferred way to get marriages because it kept the family's identity in one place. To marry outside would endanger cultural identity and family identity. And we notice throughout the Bible when people marry outside, there's always this concern about marrying foreign women, for example. We're going to see in the Jacob and Esau story that Esau is going to wind up marrying foreign women, and that's going to be a negative thing in this world. We think of this now and think, oh my goodness, that sounds so weird to marry your cousins or your second cousins or things like that. But back then, this was the norm among the patriarchs to keep things all in the family, so to speak. Exogamous marriages, again, those outside the family have consequences to them. So Abraham wants to make sure that this covenant line is going to continue, and it's going to continue through Isaac and within this particular family. So the servant is going to travel to Haran, and while he's on the way, he's coming to a well, and he prays. He prays for God to reveal to him the wife that he's picked out for Isaac. Now, this is a biblical pattern, encounters at the well. In the ancient world, we might think of the well kind of as the singles bar in some sense. People are gathering there. That's where the women tend to gather a couple times a day to draw water, and it becomes a central focus. We see this generationally played out. Isaac is going to get a wife from the servant who finds the woman at the well. Jacob is going to meet Rachel at the well. Moses is going to meet his wife at a well. And then eventually we get to the New Testament, and we see an echo of this in Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. Now, this is a different woman. She has a different past, but it's an echo of this Old Testament covenant promise that this woman who's a Samaritan is going to be included in God's family, going to be included in the covenant, because these covenant marriages tend to happen at the well, and that's a sign that the covenant is moving forward. So the servant prays to God, show me whichever woman answers his request, give me a drink. That's the one. That's going to be the one for Isaac. And it's a prayer putting everything in God's hands. The servant is relying on God's steadfast love, his covenant faithfulness to show him who the right bride is for Isaac. And of course, Rebekah comes to the well. She's young, she's beautiful. She gives the servant a drink. She even waters the camels. And, well, this is the one. And so the servant goes back, meets the rest of the family who are Abraham's family. Rebekah is actually the great niece of Abraham, and that's going to be the introduction to this family. It's the introduction of Rebekah's brother Laban, who's also going to be a key player in the story of Jacob a little bit later. So the question now is, will she go back? Will she go back and be Isaac's wife? There's gifts exchanged, the arrangements made, but eventually, and I love this part of the text, they ask Rebekah whether she will go or not. This is not a done deal. She has some agency here, and she is asked whether she will go with the servant to Canaan. She's not drafted against her will. And I think that's really important for this covenant promise. God is working with people who are willing to say yes to God. Certainly the servant tells the story about the prayer that he makes. This is a God-ordained kind of thing, and she goes along with that. And she is going to go with this servant back to Canaan to meet Isaac. And the encounter that they have is really a beautiful story. You know, they're riding on the camels and they're coming near where Isaac is, and he's walking through the field, and she sees him walking through the field, and she asks the servant, who is that man walking through the field? And she jumps down from the camel, although the Hebrew seems to suggest she kind of fell off the camel to go and meet him. She puts a veil on, which is kind of a marriage image. All of that is taking place here. It's a very interesting way of looking at a wedding, but they're going to be joined together. And it's said that Isaac loved Rebekah, and they're going to move on to the next generation. It's a beautiful story when you read it in that context, but it has all kinds of echoes that go all the way through the Bible. The encounter at the well, the marriage. You have this repeated pattern that's going to take place in Isaac's generation. Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah's going to be barren, just like Sarah was barren. It's going to take God working within this family to make the covenant promise happen. God has promised Isaac a family. He comes to Isaac with the same covenant promise that he gave to Abraham. And Genesis 23 and 24 is all about how that covenant now is lodged in Isaac. Rebekah is going to be barren, but the intervention of God brings promised children. The family's going to continue and be preserved with God's help. One of the things I find interesting about this is that when you look at the story of Isaac, after all the buildup in the story of Abraham, the longing and the waiting for this son, this heir to be born, Isaac really doesn't have a whole lot to do here in this story. He's kind of a bridge between Abraham and the next significant patriarch, who's going to be Jacob, who becomes renamed Israel and indeed is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Isaac is kind of a bridge, but he's a faithful bridge, and he's going to carry on the promise. It's not about his actions, it's about what God is doing through him. And so some concluding thoughts here. The death of the patriarch, Abraham, does not mean the death of the promise. What we see here is that God is always behind the scenes making things happen. God is going to keep that covenant promise regardless. And if you watch the podcast that Jeff and I did this week, or listen to it, I talk about Genesis 15 and that famous story where God gives Abraham a dream. God tells Abraham to take some animals, cut them into two, put a path in between them, and then Abraham falls asleep and has a dream. And in that dream, a pot and a flaming torch go walking through those bloodied pieces. In the ancient world, that was a covenant ceremony. When Abraham's told to do that, we would expect that he would walk through the bloody pieces and say to God, may I become like these animals if I don't keep my end of the covenant. Well, in Genesis 15, it's God symbolically who walks through those bloody pieces. God is going to keep the covenant no matter what humans do. And that's a powerful promise that's going to be fulfilled in the New Testament, in particular in Jesus Christ, who literally walks through blood and death on our behalf. And so despite human frailty, despite human faltering, and when we read these stories of the patriarchs, these are not perfect people by any stretch of the imagination. we get to the Jacob story, we're going to see some interesting stuff happen here. But the pattern's going to repeat. The covenant's going to be maintained regardless, because God is the one who's making it happen. And he's working with people where they are, giving them a sense that they are part of this creational mandate. From the very beginning, God wanted people to be his representatives, to have this vocation, and God is working with them despite their sinfulness and despite their waywardness at times. We're going to see family patterns repeat. It's a perfect text for analyzing family systems and things like that. But I love these stories because they're so human, and yet God is standing behind them. We don't see a lot of miraculous stuff happening here other than some visions and dreams, but there's some really cool stuff happening here because God is the one who's pulling the strings and making sure that this family is moving in the right direction for all of humanity, the whole human family, and for all of creation. Remember God's promise to Abraham that through you, through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. This story is our story, and it's an important one for us to know. So I hope you'll join me on Sunday as we dive into the beginning of the Jacob story, and we'll see you then. Join us in person or online, aldersgateyork.com. See you then.